Hi, welcome to the autonomic nervous system. In this chapter, we're going to do an overview about the autonomic nervous system. We've learned a little bit about it so far as you've been studying the nervous system, and you learned that you had the central nervous system, or the CNS, and we knew that was formed from the brain and the spinal cord. And then we know that we have a PNS, and you'll remember that that had a lot of the nerves and the ganglia. And you probably remember that the PNS had an afferent and an efferent division. So the CNS had information coming in through the sensory division. So we already covered sensation and all those sensory pathways. But there's also the motor division, which carries information away. Now, when we look at the motor or the efferent division, we had the somatic, remember, which went to skeletal muscle. And then we mentioned the autonomic, and pretty much all we said about it was that there was a sympathetic and a parasympathetic division. So we know that the ANS is always efferent. It's only motor, and it's involuntary. So the nerves, the structures that are innervated, the effectors, are going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And we also know that the headquarters of the ANS is going to be the hypothalamus. So what does the ANS do for us? Well, it's critical for maintaining homeostasis. Everything you don't have to think about, right? These are all your autonomic functions under control of the hypothalamus. And so when we look at the ANS, we're going to focus on the sympathetic, which you probably know is associated with your fight or flight response. We will look at the parasympathetic, which is kind of the status quo, or rest and relaxation. We're not going to go into the enteric division very much. Just know that the ENS, or the enteric nervous system, is mainly the digestive system of your gut. And we mentioned this briefly. The neurotransmitter this one uses, though, is called serotonin. And there's lots of neurons in basically your digestive system. And we talk a lot more about this one in AMP2 when we get to digestion. When we look at the sympathetic and parasympathetic, we see that they're kind of like a seesaw or a teeter-totter. There's a balance between the two. So generally speaking, when your sympathetic is activated, your parasympathetic is not. So typically, if the sympathetic is activated, that activity dominates, and the parasympathetic will basically be subdued or inhibited. Or if your parasympathetic is dominant, then your sympathetic is going to be subdued. So they tend to, if one is up, the other one is inhibited. Another thing is that most organs are dually innervated. So that means that most organs get information from both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, which makes sense, right? But there's a few organs that are only innervated by your sympathetic nervous system. And these are your skeletal muscle, your adipose tissue, your blood vessels, and your sweat glands. So when we talk about when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, you'll see that, for example, it causes lipolysis in your fat tissue. So this word lyse means to break down. So it breaks down fat. Well, there is no parasympathetic action on your fat cells. Okay, so sympathetic will have actions on these tissues. Otherwise, everything else gets information from both. So before we can study these in detail, we just have to compare and contrast and make sure we understand the difference between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So one of the big ways they're different are going to be the pathways. Remember, we look at somatic, we had the upper motor neurons. Hopefully you remember that's your precentral gyrus, right? Primary motor cortex. All of those cell bodies were there. And so that was the headquarters, right? Was the cerebrum. And then we know that the upper neuron travels down somewhere in the cord where it synapses with a lower neuron, and that lower neuron goes out to the muscle. So we basically have a sequence of an upper and a lower. If we look at the autonomic nervous system, it's a little bit different. For one thing, notice, the headquarters here are in the hypothalamus, not the cerebrum. So I'm going to have my upper neuron. Well, that's going to come down and synapse, usually somewhere in the spinal cord. But then there's two lower neurons. So when we look at the lower neuron, we have one that leaves the cord. This is called the preganglionic neuron because it's heading out to a structure called a ganglion, Remember, a ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies, and then we're going to have our post-ganglionic neuron, excuse me, which will then leave and go out to the effector. So notice we are going to have what's called a post, big long words, ganglionic neuron or axon that leaves the ganglion. And then we have a preganglionic going to the ganglion. So when we're looking at the lower, we have two. So slightly different. Now we know the effectors are different, right? We know the effectors for somatic are always skeletal muscle, and we know that the effectors for autonomic are our visceral muscle, right? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, primarily, and even the fat cells that we mentioned. So another difference are going to be the neurotransmitters that are released. So this is a picture, it's not from your book, it's just something I found online that might be helpful when you're trying to compare the somatic with the autonomic. So again, one of the main differences are the effectors. The other big difference is the headquarters or the control. We're just going to say cerebral cortex for somatic and stick with hypothalamus for the autonomic nervous system. The number of pathways, right? If we're looking at the motor pathways, you basically have one lower, right? One from the spinal cord out, whereas we always have two here. We're talking about the lower neurons from the spinal cord out, and they have funny names. They're called preganglionic and postganglionic because they're going to synapse in a ganglion, which is just a cluster of cell bodies. Don't worry too much about this part. As far as somatic, it's only excitatory. Whenever we released acetylcholine, that made muscle contract. When we look at autonomic, you'll see shortly the receptors can be either. And as far as the neurotransmitters go, somatic's always acetylcholine. That was the excitatory neurotransmitter that made your muscles contract. Whereas autonomic can also use acetylcholine, but it also uses norepinephrine. And we usually just write NE, and it also uses epi, which is very, very similar. Now, when we're looking at these two neurotransmitters, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter from every one of those preganglionic fibers. You can say free fiber or axon. The postganglionic parasympathetic also release acetylcholine. So that's the main one used in the ANS. However, the sympathetic nervous system only can release norepinephrine. So the sympathetic primarily is going to release norepinephrine at its effectors. In sweat glands, it uses acetylcholine. Everywhere else, it's using norepinephrine. But the difference is that, remember, it can be stimulatory, excitatory, or inhibitory based on the receptor, right, which is a little bit different. So you have this table in your lab manual, and I think it would be good to try to do on your own before lab. And I want you to take a minute, maybe pause this lecture to see if you could fill in the table for a moment, comparing and contrasting. So, and then I will go over with you, but just trust me, hit pause and try it on your own first. All right, I'm assuming you tried it on your own. So when we're looking at the differences, if somatic, right, we have effectors. Well, for somatic, the effector is skeletal muscle. For autonomic, we know it's our smooth muscle, right, cardiac muscle, and glands. The headquarters, let me try this again. The headquarters, what's it controlled by? Somatic, hopefully you wrote cerebrum or cerebral cortex is fine. When we're looking at autonomic, we're looking at the hypothalamus. Number of neurons from the CNS. So, technically the brain is part of the CNS. So we know that they both have an upper neuron, right? They both have an upper. One's coming from either the cerebrum or the hypothalamus. So let's ignore that. And let's look at the number of neurons from the spinal cord. Okay. So the lower neuron. Somatic has one. It goes out that ventral root and goes right to the muscle. Autonomic always has two. It has a pre and a postganglionic, because one goes to the synapse, to the ganglion, and one leaves it. Neurotransmitters, somatic is always acetylcholine, autonomic, a lot of acetylcholine, but also norepinephrine. So that's our overview of the autonomic nervous system.